I can only imagine what my eyes will see when you're there.
Good afternoon. Praise God. My name is Dr. Melvin L. Johnson. I pastor the Heart of Christ Community Church in beautiful downtown Brazoria. And we would like to welcome you to this great event titled One Nation Under God. Myself and several friends, and God has a very unique way of bringing people together. We came together and decided what can be done in which we all can come together as members of the body of Christ, that we can be able to fellowship, communicate, talk, and at the same time be reminded of who we are and what our heritage really and truly is. So we're grateful today to have been able to bring this event together, and we anticipate that if you're anything like myself and many other people who have been to such an event as this, we'll leave out here a little bit more enlightened, blessed with some great knowledge, in which you will be able to talk with your friends and your family about one nation under God. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dave Welch.
Well, thank you, and it's been a privilege to work alongside Dr. Johnson for these years, and we first met when I was National Field Director for an organization in Virginia Beach, Virginia that did similar things to what we're doing now, and you have to do it right, all the way through. Well, right now, folks, we are running a race carrying a baton that was handed to us. And in most of our lifetime right now in this room, we're getting ready to fumble the handoff. We're getting ready to lose the very precious thing that was given to us at great expense, and not hand it to our children and our grandchildren. So this is what it's all about today. So I want to thank you for being here, for taking this time, and I can assure you that we have a lot of work to do, but what you're going to hear today is an incredible gold mine by a leader and a man who has taken this and personally led it and applied it, not just written about it. So our friend and leader, David Barton.
Thanks, bro. Thanks, David. Thanks, Dr. Johnson, for having me in. Back when we started talking with Melvin contacted us, wanted us to come down, and the office talked to him and said, what do you want me to talk about? And so he said, well, let's cover one nation under God. Let's also cover pastors and churches, what they should be doing, and let's also cover some black history. And so I'm going to do some of all three of those things today as we go through. So they're kind of mixed in and out, and there'll be a lot of stories that go with this. So let me take you back to the beginning of the nation to where we are right now. Under the form of government there are 7 different human forms of government. We are called a Republican form of government. It's not a party name. It's Republican or democracy or oligarchy or monarchical or parliamentarian. We have a Republican form of government, which means we elect our leaders at the local, county, state, and federal level. That's out of Exodus 18:21 and Deuteronomy 1:15 and 16. We're told to choose leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. That's a Republican form of government. So under the documents we have, it's interesting that we're just one of many governments across the world. As a matter of fact, this year at the UN, there's 195 different nations this year. That number goes up and down every year depending on who's had a war, who's had a revolution, who's taken over whom, whatever. And if you look at where we are, we've had one constitution for 231 years. Now, we're so used to what we have that we kind of take it for granted. We assume that what we have is really kind of normal, and it's not. If you look across the world, in the same period of time, we've had one constitution. Look how often other nations have constitutions. They go through constitutions time after time after time after time. As a matter of fact, I was recently in Poland, we were meeting with the Prime Minister and some deputy secretaries there. I talked to people in Poland that in their lifetime, they have lived through 7 constitutions in their lifetime. Now, we would never imagine having another constitution. We're just so used to this. If you're from South Korea, if you're a baby boomer, you've lived through 6 constitutions in South Korea, and we consider that to be a stable nation. So when you look across the rest of the world, the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. We've gone 231 years. It's just a little different from other nations. As a matter of fact, most nations average a violent revolution every generation and a new constitution every 17 years. Last violent revolution we had was actually 243 years ago. So we got to go back a long ways to have, we're so different, so unusual, and we don't recognize that. We just kind of take it for granted, and we complain about what we got, and we don't like it, and it's got to be different. Man, we're so far ahead of where the rest of the world is. Same thing when you go to our national prosperity, our national creativity. America, the little bit that we are, we're only 4% of the world's population. And yet, when you look at our creativity and measured every year, which you can do with international copyrights, patents, many ways of measuring creativity, every year we produce more medical technology, more scientific technology, more fun technology, DVDs and movies and plays, etc. We produce more books, we produce more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. Our 4% every year produces more than the other 96 combined, every year. Recently in Germany, went over there for some American military bases and military stuff, and I got to stay at a 5-star hotel in Germany. And being a country boy from Texas, that was pretty cool. And it would have really been nice if they would have had internet in a hotel where I stayed. We got internet at Motel 6 here. I mean, give me a break. We're so used to so many things that we don't even recognize how different it is in other places. Same thing when you get to our prosperity. We are 4% of the world's population. Every year we produce 25% of the world's gross domestic product, and we don't produce more because we have more. I'm being a cowboy myself. In farming and ranching, we are 1% of America's gross domestic product, just farmers and ranchers. And yet our 1% every year from America produces enough food to feed the entire world. You see, but America is only 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land. 65 nations have a higher percentage of farmable land than America does, and we outproduce everybody combined. See, we are so blessed with things, we just kind of take it for granted. But people in previous generations did not. For example, the guy who wrote Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, came here. 1835, he's the guy who came up with the term American exceptional. He said, America is exceptional. I don't think any other nation will be able to do what these guys have done. And so we've had that term for 2 centuries, and we've been really unique because we've still got the same Constitution. So the question becomes, all right, why are we different from other nations? Who are the leaders responsible for what we have? And if you look in textbooks, and I've been appointed in a number of states, but state boards of education to the social studies standards in those states. So I see what's in textbooks. If you look at our textbooks and say, hey, what made America unique? We go to our political leaders. We say, you know, back in the beginning, we had people like George Washington. We had people like John Hancock and John Adams, and all that's fine. I mean, they played a big role, but it's interesting to me that take, for example, John Adams. Back in his day, a guy named Hezekiah Niles came to him. Hezekiah Niles was the millennial of that generation. He was the young guy. He's a young guy. He comes to him in 1818. He said, 42 years ago, you were involved in the American Revolution. Now, we young people, we really enjoy what we've got here in America, but we weren't there to see it happen. I'm doing a history book on it, and by the way, at Wall Builders, we own 100,000 documents from before 1812. I actually have the textbook that he did back in those days. It was published 1822. So in that textbook, he said, old man Adams, he said, you were there. He said, I wasn't. Tell me who's responsible for what we enjoy today in 1818 when he asked it. And Adam says, you want to know who's responsible for America being what it is? Yeah, that's what I'm asking. He said, well, if you're asking me who's responsible, right up top, you got to put the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, and of course there's the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and don't forget the Reverend George Whitefield, and you got the Reverend Charles Johnson. He starts going through and listing preachers. Now today, we might know who Whitefield is, but the chances that we know these other guys, slim to none, and yet John Adams, who's the eyewitness, is calling out the preacher. And see, today we don't study preachers whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Moran or Lemuel Haynes or Harry Hoosier? We don't need these guys. We don't give them in textbooks. And if these were the guys back in the day so responsible, let me give you just one example. Let's take Harry Hoosier for a minute. Harry Hoosier was involved in the Great Awakenings. Now, back in the day in the Great Awakenings, there were a lot of prominent preachers that you may have heard about. One of them was Francis Asbury. This guy traveled America for 40 years. He put 130,000 miles on his horse. That's a lot of riding. I mean, that's 130,000 miles on horseback. He went everywhere preaching, and the guy who went with him was Harry Hoosier. And Francis Asbury, known everywhere in America, said, Harry draws larger crowds than I do. He gets bigger crowds than I do. And then Dr. Benjamin Rush, the signer of the Declaration, very evangelical founding father. John Adams said Benjamin Rush, one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. Benjamin Rush said, I've heard him preach. He's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Time out. Benjamin, you've heard Patrick Henry and all the... No, the greatest orator I've ever heard is Harry Hoosier. Well, Harry preaches all along the frontier areas and on the western side of Pennsylvania and western side of Virginia. And that's out kind of where the rough guys are, the mountain men kind of guys. And they end up coming to the Lord. They hear the gospel, their behavior changes, and they're still mountain men, but they're not the rough guys they were. And as typical with mountain men, they tend to keep moving west. You know, they want to be on the front edge of exploration. And so they kept moving west, and they went as far west as you could go in America back then, which at that point in time was Indiana. That's as far west as you could go. I mean, that's the end. That's way past civilization because everything was on the East Coast. And so all these guys come into that area, and the people who live in those areas say, man, these guys are really different. They're not the... I mean, they're frontiersmen, but they're not like everybody. Why are they so different? And the answer was, they're a bunch of Hoosiers. Well, they were converted by Harry Hoosier. And so, and by the way, I wonder how many people in Indiana know that they were named after black evangelists. Probably not many. Now, I speak in a lot of states. I speak all over the nation. I've met 2 people from Indiana who knew where the name came from. You would think that if you had a state named after an individual, you might mention that in textbooks somewhere. We don't get anything about these guys. And as a matter of fact, not just him. If I take you to John Morant. John Morant, great story. John Morant was born in New York. His family moved to South Carolina when he's 12 years old. He's there in Charleston area. He wants to study music, so said fine. He started going to music school. He became a child prodigy with violin, with French horn, etc., just really good. And so when he was 12 years old, he was called to give concerts in the city. And on one of those concerts, as he was going to a concert one day, he had his buddy with him, they're going to a concert. John said that they passed by an open field where there was a big crowd of people, and there was a guy standing on a box that he said he was hallooing at the crowd. Well, he didn't know what it was, but the guy hallooing was actually George Whitefield, and it was one of the revivals in the First Great Awakening. And so they go by, and his friend looks over the crowd and says, hey, John, you ought to climb up in that tree behind him and blow your horn and break the meeting up. John said, that'd be fun. So he crawls up in the tree behind Whitfield. Whitfield's out here preaching away, and John crawls up this tree behind him. And just before John starts to blow his horn, Whitfield whirls around and points at him and says, prepare to meet thy God. When he said that, John fell out of the tree, just hit the ground, smack, and just laying there on the ground, and nobody did anything. He just left him laying there. And Whitefield kept preaching. He finished the sermon about 30 minutes later, and he walked over and grabbed John by the hand and picked him up and said, young man, God's got some stuff he wants you to do. And he said, now I'm leaving town. I've got another meeting, but I've got a friend here in town. You really need to talk to him, see what God wants you to do, and can I send him to you? And John said, yeah. So it was another preacher, went and spent 3 days with John, just talking to him. What does God want to do with your life? What do you want to be with your life? What kind of vision do you have? At the end of 3 days, John becomes a Christian and says, I want to be a preacher. And so he goes home and tells his family, he says, I'm going to be a preacher. I'm a Christian now. They said, do not set foot in this house again. We do not want your kind in this house. So here's a 12-year-old boy. He's coming up on 13 now. He's just been kicked out of his house. And as you can imagine, he's a little depressed over this thing, a little disconsolate. He's now been thrown out of the family. So he goes wandering off into the woods. And as he's off wandering around in the woods, he actually ends up coming on a Cherokee Indian brave that was in the woods. And this Cherokee Indian brave befriends him, and they become good friends. And for the next couple of weeks, they just go around the woods hunting together, and they're living in the woods. And this brave says, well, it's time for me to go back to my village. And he said to John, you don't have any place to go. You don't have a home anymore. Why don't you just come with me to the village? And John says, yeah, let's do that. So John goes to the village, and as John walks into the village, the chief sees him and says, "You're not a Cherokee." And he ordered all the other braves to fall on him and kill him. So here they come to kill him. And as these braves are coming at him to kill him, John starts preaching to them in fluent Cherokee. And nobody knows where in the world he got Cherokee. Never had it before. He starts preaching in fluent Cherokee. Ends up, the chief becomes a Christian. The chief looks at John and says, "You know what you've just told us? Every other Cherokee village needs to hear this. Can I send you around to all the other Cherokee villages and you share this?" So he gave him 40 braves, and he went from village to village to village to make sure he is protected. At 13 years old, John Morant becomes the first black American successfully to evangelize Native Americans. Now, a story most of us have never heard. It's a story that John told. This is a book that he did 1785. He's 37 years old. Unbelievable story of this guy. Went through the American Revolution. And of course, having good relations with Native tribes was really key in the American Revolution. So, huge contribution. Don't hear anything about him at all. You've got guys like Lemuel Haynes. Now, Lemuel Haynes is the first black man to receive a degree of higher education in America. He's a pastor. He is also the first black man to have a published sermon in American history. You would think the guy that got the first degree of higher education, who had the first published sermon, somebody might say something about it. Oh, by the way, here's an original painting of him back in the 1700s. You notice anything interesting about his church? It's a white church. Black guy pastoring a white church. They didn't do that back then. It was all populated with racism. Racism did exist, but let me tell you, there's a whole huge segment of America that didn't experience the racism that was common in the South. We just hear very little about what went on up north. We hear everything about what went on in the South. And so, and as it turns out, Lemuel Haynes was also a soldier in the American Revolution. He served with George Washington, and in his churches, and he's a very popular preacher in New York and Massachusetts, in his churches on George Washington's birthday, he would have a sermon about his commander-in-chief with whom he'd served in the American Revolution. Hear nothing about that. We actually own Lemuel Haynes' Bible from back in the day with all these documents we have. Really cool. Lemuel Haynes broke all sorts of firsts, and we just don't hear anything about him in history. Go to the American Revolution for a moment. Kind of a starting place that we can talk about is the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere in April 1775. Paul Revere is writing to warn Americans of what's happening. Now, interestingly, he wasn't the only guy writing. There were a lot of others writing as well. One of those guys that was writing was a guy named Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was a black patriot. And I love this image we have in American history that we don't see today, that you've got black and white riding and saying, "Hey, Americans, wake up, danger coming." So we had black and white riding. Now, Wentworth Cheswell, cool guy. Wentworth Cheswell, this is one of the documents we have of him when he was a judge. Wentworth Cheswell is the first black American elected to office in America. He was elected to office in 1768. He's a black guy elected in a very white community in New Hampshire. As a matter of fact, he was reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions in New Hampshire, probably as the chief historian of New Hampshire. All sorts of, you would think the first black elected to office in America, somebody would say something about. How come we don't know a thing? Well, he's a really devout Christian, and you know there was good relations, and so we can't talk about that. And there were bad relations too, and that's what we do hear about. And in history, you're supposed to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly. We tell the bad and the ugly. Very rarely do we mention the good anymore, and that's why there's so much discontent, particularly with younger kids about America, because they get a bad and ugly side, and they never hear the good side. When you got to, you know, it's like David in the Bible. Remember the story of David in the Bible? David killed a lion, he killed a bear, he killed a Goliath. That's really good. David can't keep his own kids under control, whether it's Absalom or Amnon or Adonijah, and that's pretty bad. And then David sleeps with Bathsheba and murders her husband, and that's pretty ugly. But the Bible gives us everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that's the way history is supposed to be done. We just have turned it into a political tool today, which it should never have been. There's just too many inspiring stories. And by the way, I'm a white guy. How come I know all this? Because this is American history. These are my guys too. It has nothing to do with white, black, anything else. This is part of who we are as a nation, and I love heroes, and I study heroes, and I study all sorts of heroes. So Wentworth Cheswell is one of those guys I really enjoy. Well, as Paul Revere is writing, he's not just writing randomly across the countryside saying, "Hey, everybody, wake up, the British are coming." He's actually looking for 2 guys. He's looking for John Hancock, and he's looking for Sam Adams, because the British have sent out 800 soldiers with one order, and that order is find and kill Hancock and Adams. The commander said, "I want their bodies right back here at my feet." So what you've got is Revere is trying to find these two guys and alert them. The 800 British are coming at them. So he rides to where he knows they're staying. They stay at the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. It's very common that the preachers would stay at the political guys, and that's where they talked and got input from the preacher, and what did the preacher think about it. And so they're at the home. And so when word gets to the guys there, Hancock and Adams turned to Pastor Clark and said, Pastor, are your people ready for this? 800 British coming. He got real indignant and backed up and said, of course they are. I've trained them for this very hour. So the next day, when 800 British come to town, there are 70 guys out there to face the 800 British. The 70 guys are out of his church. It was his church that went out there to defend the town. That is the first battle of the American Revolution, was a church defending the community against 800 British. And the bad news was, Pastor Clark said, you know, the Bible teaches us a lot about war, teaches us a lot about military. Even John the Baptist, when he was baptizing, had specific instructions for the officers and for the soldiers. He said the Bible makes it really clear that God will not bless an offensive war. He will bless a defensive war. You can defend yourself, but you can't start a war. So the news is the British get the first shot. You don't get to shoot until they've shot at you. If they shoot at you, you can shoot back because God allows you to defend yourself. And that's in Nehemiah, that's in John, that's in Exodus. You can defend yourself, but you can't start it. Oh, good. 800 guys get the first shot at 70 guys. Not going to be too cool, and it wasn't cool. As it turned out, at the end of that battle, there were 18 Americans laying on the ground. Those 18 Americans included white patriots like John Robbins, black patriots like Prince Estabrook, and they were on the ground together because they all went to church together. They're all out of the same church. And even back in the day with Prince Estabrook, we built monuments to him back in the day of the Revolution, and we still build monuments to him today. It's just that nobody really knows who he is anymore. But we used to know. Great black soldier. And again, blacks and whites in church together, attending church together. You also have in June of 1775, this is when we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, John Trumbull painted this painting, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and off on the side, to make sure you would see him, he put the hero of the battle right over there. That is Peter Salem standing beside Thomas Grosvenor. And again, that image of black and white. The guys who lived through this and saw this have a very different image than what we often portray today. Peter Salem. This is the guy credited with winning, helping save countless American lives in the Battle of Bunker Hill. We didn't win it, but we were winning it until we ran out of ammunition. Then when we ran out of ammunition, they're about to kill us. And had it not been for the actions of Peter Salem, there have been a lot of Americans that would have died. So he got presented to 14 different military combinations. They presented him to Commander-in-Chief. They built monuments to him. We talked about him in textbooks for generations. This is a textbook from about 40 years later, and we make sure that we know who Peter Salem is because he's the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then even 40 years after that, now we're into color textbooks and we still know who Peter Salem is. And by the way, another great hero in that battle was Salem Poor. And he got the same commendations and presented to Commander-in-Chief. And man, we've never heard of these guys today. And then if you move to December 1776, this is when Washington is crossing the Delaware. And right up front in the boat there is a guy named Prince Whipple, who was with Washington throughout the Revolution. He was a free guy. He served. He fought for his country. See, the term of enlistment back then was only 1 year. He re-upped every single year. He kept going back and fighting. You had black patriots like Prince Whipple and like Oliver Cromwell. We painted these guys with the paintings and we don't even see them today. We don't even notice. We don't know who these guys are. Then you get past that, you go to July 1777, one of the most fun stories of the Revolution from where I sit. It involves a guy named Charles Lee. Charles Lee is the second in command of the American forces. There's George Washington, then there's Charles Lee. Charles Lee has just got himself captured. He is now being held by the British. How do you get back your second in command? You go capture their second in command and have a prisoner exchange. Their second in command is a guy named General Richard Prescott. Now, Richard Prescott is in the middle of Newport, Rhode Island, on an island surrounded by the British fleet and garrisons of British soldiers. We got to go in there and capture him. And by the way, if they know we're there, they're going to kill all the Americans that come. So what do? Well, Colonel William Barton came up with a plan. And by the way, his plan was essentially the birth of special forces. What he did was he had 40 guys from his unit in there and said, guys, we got a suicide mission here. We got to go capture the second in command. They're surrounded by the British fleet, garrisons of soldiers. We got to do it. You can't even take your guns with you because if you do, it may go off and the British know we're there and then we're all going to die. This is a death mission. Anybody want to volunteer? 40 guys, all 40 volunteered, 20 blacks, 20 whites. First in line was Jack Sisson. So when they set out on the mission, to go capture the British second in command. They figure the way to do this is they're going to go late at night. So what they do, you've got the British fleets all lined up out in the harbor, and they've been unloading all these troops off all the ships, and you got all these guys there. And so what they have to do is they've got to get past all the ships. So what they do is decide to go maybe 12, 1, 2 in the morning. So they get in the rowboats. Jack Sisson's up front. He's leading them. And so as they're rowing, they wrap their oars with cloth to be like mufflers, quiet as they go through the water. And so they go right under all the British boats. They get over to the island. They knock out the British guards there on the island. And then they find the general is barricaded inside a huge oak door back a ways to the back of the fort. How do you break that down without being heard? And you got to do it quick and get out of there. They've knocked out all the guards, but and Jack Sisson said, I'll do it. No issue. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Princess Bride. Remember Princess Bride? You remember Vesic is chasing the six-fingered man who killed his father. And finally, the guy's there, but he's on the other side of the door. If you remember the clip from the movie, he can't get in the door. Trying to get in the door, remember? And then he says, that's what Jack Sisson did. Jack said, you guys move over. They did. He lowered his shoulder, went through the door, knocked it off the hinges, broke the bar on the other side. They went in, they found the commander there. He promptly hit the commander on the chin, knocked him out, picked him up, put him under his arm, carried him out, put him in the boat, rowed back across, and they had the prisoner exchange. One of the greatest missions in American history, and special forces. Who in the world's heard of Jack Sisson? You know, this ought to be an action movie somewhere. You know, it's a cool story. And then you move past that. I'm going to choose one more story, 1781. In 1781, we're at the Battle of Yorktown, last battle in the Revolution, and we have young General Lafayette, the French general, 19-year-old. Washington adopted him as a son. He was so key in helping us win. And standing right with him is this guy right here. Now, I showed this to school kids and said, who's that black man? Oh, that's a slave. No, it's not. Lafayette hated slavery. He fought against slavery in America, and he also fought against slavery in Europe, and particularly in France. Huge anti-slavery guy. This is his good friend, a guy by the name of James Armistead. Now, James Armistead, really close friends with Lafayette, and they talk a lot, and they talk all the time, and Lafayette is talking about, man, we're just at such a disadvantage fighting the British because we never know what they're going to do till they do it. We don't hear about a surprise attack until we get attacked, and the surprise is on us. If we could just know what the British are going to do ahead of time, it'd so help. And so they just talk about it, and James thinks about it and says, I think I can help here. I can go get intelligence from the British and bring it back. No, James, you can't do that. It's really dangerous. You remember what happened to Nathan Hale? They hung him when they found out he was spying. And James said, no, I can do it. And so, they go back and forth, and finally Lafayette says, okay, if you're determined to do this, do it. But this is really deadly. He said, I can do it. And so what happens was James goes straggling into the British camp. He said, oh, the mean Americans. I so hate the Americans. They so mistreat me, so abuse me. Will you kind British please take me in? I've had it with the Americans. And so the British take him in, and he starts faithfully serving the British, doing everything he can do to help them in any way, shape, fashion, or form. He's so good at helping them that they assign him to one of the British generals in the camp. The British general they assigned him to is a guy named Benedict Arnold. You do catch the irony here, right? Benedict Arnold is the traitor that used to be an American general who's now the British general, and James is serving him every day. And of course, Benedict Arnold meets with the British generals every day, and James hears everything going on, and at night he smuggles all that information back to Lafayette and back to Washington, and so they're ready for the stuff, and so, suddenly we're knowing when the British are coming, the British are making the surprise attack, and the camp's empty. Nobody's there anymore. Well, what happens is the British send Benedict Arnold off on a mission, and so James stays behind, and Cornwallis, who's the commander-in-chief of all the British, goes to James and said, James, you really faithfully served here. You've been such a help and a blessing to the British. Would you be willing to serve me? Arnold's now gone. Would you say, yes, sir, I'll serve you. And so he starts serving Cornwallis, who's the commander-in-chief, and he hears everything going on, and every night gets it back to Lafayette and Washington. And so after this goes for a while, one day Cornwallis confides, and Armistead said, James, somewhere there's a spy in the camp. Every time we go to attack the Americans, suddenly they know we're coming and they're not there anymore. He said, we got to figure out who the spy is. I mean, this is bad stuff. We got to figure out where the leak's coming from. He said, James, I'm going to ask you to do something really difficult. Would you go back and spy on the Americans? I know you hate them. I know I know they mistreat you, but oh man, that'd be really hard. I don't know if I can do it. Okay, for you guys, I'll do it. He becomes the first double spy in American history. He feeds all the bad information to the British, feeds all the good information to Washington Lafayette. We end the American Revolution, and George Washington says he saved countless American lives. He shaved months off the revolution. It's really kind of like the first military intelligence that we had. And it goes back to James. I mean, these aren't stories we hear. We don't know these stories anymore. We should. They're part of American history. We used to know these stories. We just don't know them in the current generation. One more thing from that period, 1793. Here's the newspapers from 1793, August the 13th. Here's the article, and I want you to see. In the borough of Easton, Pennsylvania, a free Negro man of the name of Thomas Hercules was on the 6th day of July last chosen town clerk of that borough by a decided majority of votes. This we mention as proof of the growing liberality of the present age, when virtue and worth alone, and not mere color or trippery or rank and splendor, begin to recommend a man to places of trust and confidence. Hey guys, we just elected a black guy in a white town, and it's not because of his color, because we don't care about color. We care about whether you're competent, whether you can do the job. Another black guy, yeah, we had blacks elected back then. We just never hear that anymore. We think the first time we had blacks elected office was in Reconstruction, when the federal government got involved and said, everybody, you're going to have a different kind. No, we had a whole, but see, this is not the part of history we get anymore. Now, you look at this, and you look at race, and it was not that big an issue in many areas. It was in the South, no question about it. It was not in many other places. How about today? It's interesting that if you look at scientific testing results today, what DNA testing results tell you is this. All races share 99.99% of the same genetic materials, which means that a division of races is largely subjective. From a scientific standpoint, there's just not an iota of difference between races. But we sure make a big deal out of things, don't we? We make a big deal out of that 1/1000th of 1%. And it's an interesting thing, that subjective races, because when you look, for example, at what the Scripture says, Acts 17:26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. He made from one man all the nations of men. Now, who's that one man? That's Adam. Do you know how many generations have been since Adam? It's been 150 generations since the time of Adam. Dr. Johnson, would you stand up a minute? I want you guys to meet my 150th cousin right here. We all got the same parents. We're all part of the same family. From one man, he made everybody. And now, it's interesting, all the face of the earth came from one man, so we're all related. Now, a biblical view of race is really simple. God, the way God sees race is there's only two groups. What are the two groups? Those that know God and those that don't know God. And that's the only thing that matters to him. As a matter of fact, we're told, remember what we're told in 1 Samuel 16:7, the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. All he cares is, do you know me or do you not know me? The outside is not what matters to him. That's a biblical way of thinking. And the more biblical you think, the better things get. The more secular you think, the more you divide into groups, and you have to have the conflicts. And that's the difference between the North and the South. North was founded by a whole lot of Bible folks like Pilgrims. You know, the first load of slaves that came to America came to Virginia. The second load of slaves that came to America came to the Pilgrims. When that load of slaves arrived at the Pilgrims, they promptly freed all the slaves and imprisoned all the slave owners. Completely different. See, Bible areas have a whole different view of those that kind of have religion but not necessarily a knowledge of the Bible. So that's what you have here. Now, having said that, why don't we hear this kind of history today? Because it's back there. How did I find out if it's not back there? I can take you to books like this. This is one of the heroes in the Civil War. His name is Joe Wilson. But notice, it's a history of Negro soldiers in the United States in the wars of 1775, 1812, and the Civil War. So all these heroes that I've just been talking about are in the book. Then you've got books by William Nell, Services of Colored Americans in the Wars of 1776 and 1812. You also have Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. These are done by William Nell. William Nell is the first black man to hold any position in the federal government, civil position in federal government. Great historian, Carter Woodson, the father of black history. Carter Woodson has all this stuff. So we've got all these records of this stuff, and you find out things like, for example, in Massachusetts, there never was a time when blacks could not vote in Massachusetts. Not only did they hold office in those northern states, there was never a time when they couldn't vote. That's real different from the way it was in the South, but that's part of American history, and most of the population was in the North, not the South. So you look at this kind of stuff and you say, how did it change? Where did all the heroes go? And it changed with this guy right here. Now, Woodrow Wilson, significantly, Woodrow Wilson, in 1902, he did this 5-volume set, A History of the American People. Woodrow Wilson is no lightweight when it comes to writing histories. This is actually the foreword out of this book. This is what they gave to the bookstores to sell the book, because he is the president of Princeton University. He's got PhDs galore. I mean, but see, the problem with Wilson is he's a hardcore racist. When he became president of the United States, he took every black that served in the federal government and kicked them all out except one. He wanted a token black, so he could say he had blacks in his administration. He is the guy from his history book, that 5-volume, and I've got the 5-volume set. That 5-volume set, from that 5-volume set is where that they took and wrote the script for a movie. One of the first movies in American history. It was called The Birth of a Nation. It was a Klan recruiting film. They got the script from Woodrow Wilson's textbooks that he wrote. As a matter of fact, the first film ever shown at the White House was that movie, and it was to recruit Klan members. It was under Woodrow Wilson that we have what's called the second revival of the Klan, where then in Washington, D.C., the Klan marched openly up and down Constitution and Independence Avenues. U.S. senators, U.S. congressmen, open members of the Klan. That's all under Woodrow Wilson. This is the introduction to that book, and it said, look here, man, he's a smart guy. Look at all those PhDs and all those doctorates he's got, and you know what? Just credentials don't make you a good guy, not at all. Same today in academia. We got a lot of guys with PhDs who don't know up from down or common sense or anything else. If you don't know, there are 92 legally identified genders in America today. 92. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. There's 2 genders, just take nature. Cowboy that I am, we just helped do a roundup up in North Dakota. We pushed about 1,200 cattle out of the brush. We had 580 calves that we needed to take, and we give them 7 vaccinations so they won't get sick. And you put an ear tag in them, know which ranch they belong to. And we had cowboys and cowgirls working those calves, 580 calves, and nobody had any difficulty telling which was a male calf and which was a female calf. It was really easy. The Bible says in 4 locations, and he made them male and female. See, there's so much that goes with learning where that you become actually pretty stupid if you don't have the right knowledge imparted. It's not what the degrees are. He had lots of degrees. So did he just completely ignore blacks in history? No, he didn't. He gave them some token knowledge, some token acknowledgement. This is one of the places where he does talk about blacks in American history. Now, you see the picture there? It's not a very good looking picture of a black, a superannuated darky in Richmond, Virginia. See that? Why would he do that? Well, do you guys know who Darwin is? What's the name of Darwin's book? The Origin of Species. Yeah, that's all we ever cover today. How about the rest of it? The origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored, here it is, look at this. The preservation of favored races and the struggle for life. Did you know that Darwin taught that the darker your skin is, the less evolved you are? That the more evolved you become, the lighter skin you get. And so what he does is he shows this. Now, what's he doing? Oh, blacks aren't as evolved as whites are. That's why they look like monkeys? Are you kidding me? We're after Confederate statues. Why don't we go after evolution from Darwin? Because that's racist stuff. That's hardcore racist stuff. No. He's smart. He's a scientist. No, but you see what happens. So this is the book. This book from Woodrow Wilson is what shifted the way that we teach American history today. And it's just unfortunate it did, because there's so many good things back there, but he just turned in the wrong direction. On top of that, not only do we not teach the full story of American history, we've become pretty anti-Christian in the way we teach the story. I'll give you another example. Let me take you to the civil rights movement for a minute. In the civil rights movement, you remember what happened back in the 50s and 60s. If you lived through it, you remember it. If you didn't, you may have studied it in school. But what happened with the March on Washington, the Birmingham Fire Department, what they did to the peaceful protesters, turning the fire hoses on them, turning the dogs on them, even calling out the state militia, blacks and whites marching together and get stabbed by bayonets for being in the peaceful march. You know, the way this got started in Birmingham was the guy on the right there is Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. He was a pastor in Birmingham, and Martin Luther King was a pastor in Atlanta. And Shuttlesworth called King and says, I think the time's right now. Why don't you come from Atlanta and help us here in Birmingham? And so in Birmingham is where you see so much of the Civil Rights March, and it's the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Now this is the pledge card they had. If you're going to be part of the Civil Rights Movement back then, you have to sign the pledge card, and you can circle how you want to. You can circle how you want to volunteer. Do you want to run errands or drive car, or fix food for volunteers, or clerical? You can volunteer, but you have to sign here, and you have to make a pledge that you will follow the rules of the Civil Rights Movement. What are the rules? Let me show you the card that was given to everyone that they had to fill out. I hereby pledge myself, my person and body, to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. I pledge. 1, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Did you guys learn that about the civil rights when you went through school? Did you hear the number one thing about the civil rights to be part of it? Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. 2, remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. 4, pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. And on it goes. All 10 commandments. And after you agree to that, then you sign the pledge. See, this was a spiritual movement. We get it as a political protest movement. Well, that was part of it, but that wasn't the objective. It was a spiritual thing first. And so here's why it's significant and why I say this. I told you I've been appointed in a number of states to do social studies standards. So in a state 2 years ago, as we were working on social studies standards, we got into the civil rights era. And I said, let's make sure that when we talk about Dr. King, that we point out that he was a pastor. Let's call him the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. They said, oh no, we can't do that. I said, what do you mean you can't do that? We can't say that he's a pastor and put that in textbook. Why can't? Was he a pastor? Yeah. But we can't put that in textbooks? No. I said, wait a minute. You just had the kids read the letter from Birmingham jail, and you're not going to tell the kids that that was Pastor Martin Luther King Jr. writing other pastors on the outside saying, why aren't you guys in here in jail with me? If you were standing up the way you would be, you wouldn't be out there comfortable. You'd be in. You're not going to tell them it was a pastor writing other pastors? No, we can't say that. So we go through today and learn the civil rights movement is not even a Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, it's just Martin Luther King Jr. See, that completely guts who he was and what he stood for and what he did. So we've got this bias on the way we cover history today, and it's just not a healthy thing. So I love what Booker T. Washington said. He said, those doing the vital things of life are those who read the Bible and are Christians and not ashamed to let the world know it. Now notice, those who are doing the vital things of life, read the Bible, they're Christians, and they're not ashamed to let the world know it. Do you know that right now in America, nearly 70% of Christians will not share their faith with anyone else? In 2006, 47% of Americans were born-again Christians. This year, it's down to 31%. So in 13 years, we have dropped 14%. Keep that up, in 25 more years, we won't have born-again Christians. It's crazy. We have got, not ashamed to let the world know it. Today, you let the world know it, you'll take a beating. This is just the culture of polarization. If you stand on the wrong side of marriage or of bathrooms or anything else, you're going to take a beating for it, so just get used to it. That's just where we are right now. But you got to not be ashamed to let the world know it. So the final part I want to kind of cover is, we've gone through some of the black history, we've gone through some of the role of pastors in churches. Let me turn now to keeping us one nation under God. One nation under God, but how to keep it. I want to go to this Bible verse. Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, sins a reproach to any people. Now, we love to sing God Bless America, but my gosh, give him something to work with. It's hard to bless America if you're not doing stuff he can bless. Agreed? Righteousness exalts a nation. So you got to go to righteousness, but how do you get righteous policies enacted? We're told in Proverbs 29:2 that when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. You're not going to get righteous people making bad policies. You're not going to get bad people making righteous policies. The way you get righteous policies, you put righteous people in office, and righteous from God's standpoint, not my opinion of whether they're righteous. They have to measure up to biblical standards. And I don't even like the word Christian anymore. I avoid using the word Christian because Christian means nothing. What means something now is, are you biblical or not? I don't care if you're Christian or not. I care if are you biblical. George Barton is a very good friend, national polling. We've been doing polling in the last week together. And George identifies that right now, of the 70 different moral behaviors that he studies in polling, he can find no statistical difference between the behavior of Christians and non-Christians in moral issues. 70 different moral issues. So Christian now means everything, and a lot of it's anti-Bible, quite frankly. So I don't care whether you're Christian or not. I care is, do you live by biblical standards? That's where righteousness comes from, is by doing things according to God's standards. So President James A. Garfield, interesting guy. He's the 20th President of the United States. And by the way, this is one of the letters we own from James A. Garfield there at the bottom. In this letter, he recounts that he had just finished preaching a revival service where he spoke 19 discourses in the meeting. He preached 19 times at the revival. He said that 34 folks were added to the church, and he baptized 31 of them by immersion. What do you think happens today if any president holds a revival meeting and baptizes anybody? That's what presidents did in previous generations. By the way, James A. Garfield had been in Congress for a number of years. He helped pass the first 23 civil rights law in America, and he's just a great guy. But he talked about the fact of politics and what makes it tick. This is what he said. He says, now, more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. He said, if that body be intelligent, brave, and pure, it's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature. He said, if the next centennial does not find us a great nation, that's where we are now. We are in the next centennial from where he was. If the next centennial does not find us a great nation, it will be because those who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation do not aid in controlling the political forces. That's the church. Church represents the culture, the morality, the enterprise of the nation. Church does. But if the nation is not reflecting, that's because the church is not aiding and controlling those political forces. So in looking at controlling the political forces, let me take you back to a fundamental question. Go back to the Garden of Eden. Here's the question. Why did God make man? Garden of Eden, Bible tells us. Now, what we've been told since 1646, when the Shorter Catechism came out, is man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That's why God made man. My question for you is, can you show me a Bible verse where that's the answer? That that's the purpose for which God made man? If you go back to the Bible and say, all right, that's a good purpose, but that's not what the Bible says. Go to Genesis 1 and 2, because that's where you see God made man. It starts with the first day, the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. Goes through all the days. You get it twice. Genesis 1 kind of gives you one version of it, and Genesis 2 focuses a lot more in on the making of man on the sixth day. And what you get was, after God had made all the stuff on the 6 days, it said He looked at everything He had made. And in Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and 15, it says He looked at everything He made, and He saw that He had no one to tend His garden. So He made man. He'd made everything. He didn't have anybody to take care of His stuff. He made man to take care of His stuff. That's our purpose for being here, is to take care of God's stuff. Now, what is God's stuff? Well, we know from the Scriptures that the earth is Lord and all the fullness thereof, which is a current teaching that's out there now, is something that, and by the way, that's Luke 19:13, where He told His disciples, occupy till I come, get involved with taking care of my stuff till I get back. This is where we're often told about the 7 mountains. I don't know if you know anything about that, but 7 mountains, these are areas where Bible speaks very clearly about each of these areas. Business is His area, and government, and family, and religion. We're supposed to take care of His stuff in all these areas. And so wherever we are, that's part of God's stuff, and He wants us taking care of it, being good stewards of it. But I want to pick on government for just a moment, because as David mentioned when we started this thing, in America, everybody's involved with government because this is a stewardship government. It's not like a lot of nations. It belongs to us. So if we're going to take care of his stuff, every one of us has got to be involved in this. And let me show you kind of how this works. The least, what I want to say, the least stressful way to be involved in government is voting. This is the easiest. This is entry level. This is K3 stuff. Vote. That's easy. You don't have to go to school to learn how to vote. You don't have to go through training school to learn how to run for office or how to raise funds or just voting. Here's the deal. According to the Constitution, if you're 18 or above, that's 100% of the voting power. Everybody that's 18 or above, you get to be a voter in America. Now, the only thing we ask you to do is register so that we can make sure that you didn't vote 10 times or somebody didn't vote 10 times for you. We want it one person, one vote. So everybody over 18, Constitution says, can vote. Just register. So at that point in time, only 67.1% of Americans are registered to vote. Right off the bat, we have a little over 100 million Americans say, we don't care what happens to America, we're not going to do nothing with it. We can't even be part of the process because we're not even registered to vote. We can't be salt and light in that arena because we won't even get close to that arena. So right off the bat, you start with this. Now, there's generally two general types of elections in election years. You have what the presidential elections are, which happened 2 years ago and 6 years ago and 10 years ago. And so at presidential elections, what happened since 1980, 54% of registered voters vote in a presidential election. But that's 54% of 67%, not 54% of the nation. So 54% of 67% means that only 36% of adults actually vote in a presidential election. This is when you get your highest voter turnout. 330 million in America, that's why you get 110 million in the presidential election, 1 out of 3 vote. And it only takes half of that to choose the winning candidate. So 18% of Americans choose the president every election since 1980. In the off years, where we are this past November, that's an off year election, the president wasn't on the ballot. In off years elections, 39% of registered voters vote, but that's 39% of 67%, which means 26% of adults vote. It takes only half of that to choose the winner, so 13% of Americans are choosing the winner, which means since 1980, 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States, and 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors, senators, and congressmen. That's pretty pathetic, that we're at 1 out of 5 and 1 out of... You don't like the way things are? Get busy and get people just to go be a good steward of what God's given them. Get them to tend His garden. Get them to be involved with that. So, but you also, in addition to having presidential and state elections, you've also got what happens with local elections. And in a local election, generally the turnout is 6%. That's what it averages nationally for a city kind of election. But of course, that's 6% of registered voters, which means only 4% of actual voters vote in an election. It takes half of that to choose the winner, so at 2%. Let me go to Houston for a minute. You guys that live in Houston aren't aware of how big you are. The mayor of the city of Houston is larger than 25 separate states in the United States. Choosing the mayor of Houston is the equivalent of choosing a governor in 25 states. And we do it with 2% choosing the winner? That's poor. See, and what happens is when you get into local elections, you may remember about 4 years ago, Fort Worth School District started this, said, we've thought about this, and we think there should only be 1 bathroom and 1 locker room. We're not going to have genders. We're not going to use a binary system, male and female. We think that boys and girls should shower together and go in the same locker room together and use the same bathroom. And that was in Fort Worth. And then that became the national policy of the Department of Education. Said that was a great idea. We hadn't thought about that. And so they came out and said, if you get federal dollars, federal education dollars, you will have just 1 bathroom and 1 locker room. Well, there are a lot of people across the United States that said, no, not here. Great example of that was in the town of Bentonville, Arkansas. It's up in northwest Arkansas. It's a town of 40,000 people. As a matter of fact, that's the home of Walmart. 40,000 people in that town. And a Christian lady there said, we're not doing this in my school. I'm going to run for the school board and make sure that we have genders, that there is boys' bathroom and girls' bathroom. And so she ran for the school board. It's a town of 40,000 people, and she won her election. Do you know there were only 35 votes cast in the whole election? in a town of 40,000. She wins the election with a total of 35 votes cast. And then you go to Riceville, Iowa, and a pig farmer in Riceville said, "Nuh-uh, we're not doing this in my school district." And so he ran for office. He put his name on the ballot. It turned out, as a pig farmer, he got busy the day of the election, so he didn't get a chance to vote that day. And it's not what you think. It's not that he lost by 1 vote. It is that nobody voted at all in that election, at all. If he had voted for himself, he would be the entire school board all by himself. With 1 vote, he would have been the school board. See, this is where so much happens, is down at the local level, and this is where we pay so little attention. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but I want to go through one more segment. I'll tell you about the local stuff. So we're supposed to be good stewards of taking care of what God's given us, tend His garden, which government's part of it. So who should I vote for? That is the wrong question. It doesn't matter who you vote for, it matters what you vote for. The question is not who I vote for, it's what I vote for. Now, so what's the answer? What should I vote for? Let me go back to this verse. You vote for righteousness. That's what you vote for first. But how do I know what's righteous and what's not righteous? And it's, by the way, righteousness exalts a nation. How do you determine the righteousness of a nation? How do you measure that? And by the way, because the Bible tells us to choose leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands, which is local, county, state, and federal, how's the righteousness of a nation measured? How's the righteousness of a state measured? How's the righteousness of a county measured? And how's the righteousness of a city measured? You could have a city that's blessed and a state that's not blessed. You could have a state that's blessed and a nation that's not blessed. I mean, there's all sorts of, because there's all these jurisdictions. And if that jurisdiction will do what God says, they're going to get blessed, even if the rest of the state doesn't. So it's real simple stuff. So how do you measure it? And the answer is by public policies and by how they conform to God's standards. Here's the proof of that. Do you remember when Elijah confronted Ahab and Jezebel? And he said, "You guys have really screwed up. What you've done with religious persecution, Jezebel, you just killed 100 of the Lord's prophets. And by the way, eminent domain, you took Naboth's vineyard from him, government taking property away from him. You shouldn't have done that. And you even suborned perjury to do it. You put false liars in court to say that Naboth had. So you're suborning perjury, you're using eminent domain, you're doing a religious persecution. Because of that, curse is coming on the nation. You will not see rain till I say so." So the whole nation goes into this drought kind of scenario. But how about you remember God told Elijah, there's 7,000 people here who have never bowed their knee to Baal. Did they go through the drought too? Sure did. That's not fair. No, you're not understanding what's happening. A public policy impacts every citizen, even those who disagree with it. You see, Elijah, more than anybody, disagreed with the policies because he called them out. But after he knocks off the prophets of Baal and the false prophets on the top of Mount Carmel, remember he went off to that cave and here came the big wind and here came the storm and finally the small voice speaks to him. But he is in the same drought that everybody else in the nation is in. And if it hadn't been for ravens bringing him food, he would have starved to death. So here's a good guy going through bad stuff. So how is that possible? Well, why would that happen? I got to say, I learned something from a guy at the Constitutional Convention on this, a guy named George Mason. He was talking about how God judges, how He blesses righteousness and judges sin. This is what he said. He says, "The nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, so they must be in this." He said, "By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities." Now, I know from the Bible, I will stand before God one day. I'll answer for all of my thoughts, 1 Corinthians 4. I'll answer for all my actions, Hebrews 4. I'll answer, Jesus said, Matthew 12, you'll give account for every word you've spoken. So I will answer for all of that someday in the future. Nations don't have a day in the future. God's not going to resurrect the Soviet Union 100 years from now, or a million years from now, and say, "Stalin, what were you thinking?" See, nations get blessed or cursed at the time they exist. When they go away, it's all over. So what happens is the only time God can bless or curse a nation or a city or a county or a state is at that point in time, which is why, that's why you've got to have people that do righteousness at that point in time. Otherwise, you go through the same famine that Elijah went through. I disagree with what government's doing. It doesn't matter. God's going to judge the state or the city or the nation or whatever it is at that point in time. So righteousness is also nation. Now, how do we know what righteousness is? Let me take you back to the beginning of Israel as a nation. You remember after they find Joseph is in Egypt and he ends up saving their life and he gets reunited with his father. And so Joseph's there and the 12 brothers, and he says everybody move to Egypt. And so they pack up and they move to Egypt, which works out really good. And then they end up in slavery. and they're in slavery for the next 400 years, which is not good. And God finally says, I've had it up to here with this. We're stopping this. And so he sends a deliverer, and the deliverer comes, and they have all the plagues that happen, and then they get brought out, and at the Red Sea, it destroys all their enemies, and then God leads them out in the wilderness, and pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. Really interesting. He gets them out to that mountain, and he says, okay, guys, here's the deal. You've been slaves for 400 years. You think like slaves. You act like slaves. You got the wrong mentality. And by the way, this is a great time for me to talk to you. I've gotten you out of slavery, but you don't have a clue where you're going, and you got nothing to do right now, so you're going to stay here and listen to me. So God proceeds to make them into a nation. He takes people who have been thinking wrong for a long time, who have no experience with how to do it right, and he says, here's what you need to know. And so there at the mount, he gave them 613 laws. It's how he made them a nation. He gave them laws that deal with everything a nation will ever need to deal with, business and economy and environment. All of these are part of the laws he gave. He built a nation there. And by the way, that became a superpower nation. I mean, after they put all this stuff in practice. But when he got done with all the laws, he said, oh, by the way, I do want you to know that I've got a top 10 of my laws. Not everything is the same. Some things are more important than others. So let me give you the top 10. And that's what we call the 10 Commandments. I love the fact that in Exodus 34:27 it says the 10 Commandments are the tenor of his laws. This is the heart, the soul, the guts, the backbone of his laws. And if you look at those 10 Commandments there's 3 of them that are on the ballot every time you vote. School board, city council, mayor, state rep, all the way through president. 3 things that make the top 10 list. First one is, I'm the Lord thy God. What's that? Acknowledge me. I want you to, oh, there's a separation of church and state. We can't let a kid say God at graduation. No. Acknowledge me. I'm the Lord thy God. I want you to acknowledge this. Public religious acknowledgments, which by the way goes into rights of conscience. If expressing my faith says I'm not going to participate in an abortion, or I'm not going to bake a cake for a homosexual wedding, if that's my accountability to God, that's part of what's protected there. That's the way I acknowledge God, is I want to live a biblical life. So that's one thing, is where are you on public religious acknowledgments and conscience? Second thing says, thou shalt not commit adultery. What's that? God says, listen up. Here's the deal. I told you back in Genesis, one man, one woman, lifetime union. Jesus repeats that in Matthew 19. The disciples were asking him about no-fault divorce, and Jesus said from the beginning it was not that way. Don't you remember that at the beginning he said male and female joined together, let not man put asunder. And Peter said, we're so used to having divorces. Moses let us have a divorce for any reason, no-fault divorce. He says that wasn't the way God wanted it. So he says marriage is the deal, and he says, listen up. What I'm telling you is I want sexuality confined to a man and a woman inside marriage. Anything else is wrong. Sex outside of marriage, sex before marriage, so adultery or what Bible called fornication, or homosexual sex, anything that's not a man and a woman inside of marriage is wrong. So you can say, all right, marriage, protection, sexuality. That makes his list. Third thing I'd point to is thou shalt not kill. And in Hebrew, it's not the word kill, it's the word murder. It says you don't shed innocent blood. So when you shed innocent blood, always brings a curse on the land, always, every time throughout the Bible, numerous times, which I think that pretty much fits with the abortion issue. That's innocent blood. What's happening now in New York, what's happening with the governor in Virginia saying, well, not only will we do it up through birth, we think that you should be able to take a child's life after they're born. We got problems. That's shedding innocent blood. And so abortion will make it. So 3 things that you can look at for sure are these 3 issues. So somebody's running for school board. First thing you ought to ask is where they're on the, wait a minute, I'm on the school board, we don't do anything with abortions. Yeah, but I want to know how your thinking is. Because if you don't get these things right, you're not going to get God's blessing on what you do. If you can't acknowledge something this simple in your worldview, so you ask those 3, say, well, wait a minute, my big deal is climate change, or my big deal is race relations, or my big deal is we got to get the border fixed, or it's immigration. Great, I'm glad you got those deals. That's part of the 613, but these are the top 10. And you start with the top 10. And once you get these fixed, then we can talk about climate change, or we can talk about border, or whatever. But these are the first ones you start with. So if you want righteousness to exalt a nation, that's where you have to go every time. So that's part of tending the garden. That's what we as citizens are supposed to do. We may not be called to government, so don't run for office. You are called to be salt and light, and that means vote. You got to have that standard, and that's at local elections all the way through. So that's a 7 mountain kind of stuff, and every one of those areas we need to be involved. Here's the final clip I want to leave you with. I think America's got some major problems. We just did a book called This Precarious Moment, where we take 6 of the big issues facing America right now, and we give very specific solutions for how people can do that. It's race relations and immigration, it's dealing with millennials and biblical worldview that they don't have but need, and what do you do with the relationship with Israel, and the church is not functioning the way it's supposed to. And we go through 6 categories. But I would say the biggest problem we have facing Americans right now, the number one problem is that we're obsessed with the national focus. And I don't care where you get your news. I mean, if you're left, right, or center, it doesn't matter. What you get is a big dose of national news. When's the last time you've seen any of those guys cover anything going in Brazosport County? You don't get it. It's not where you live. They will give you everything. And so what happens as a result, we get this obsession with national news, and it frustrates us because you know what? I'm well connected in Congress, but I can't get Nancy Pelosi to get the discharge petition going on let's not have late-term abortions, and I can't get Mitch McConnell to take the 600 bills the House passed last year and move them through the Senate, and so I get frustrated with what's going on in Congress, and I wish I know justices in the U.S. Supreme Court. I can't get them to rule right. I mean, what Justice Roberts did this week was siding with the 4 pro-abortion judges to say that the Louisiana pro-life law is not. Man, Roberts, what are you thinking? And then if I could call, say, hey, we've got to get this stuff. I know these people, and I still can't get anything done, and I know them better than a lot of people do. And so what happens is we all get paralyzed. See, we see all this national news going on, and we can't do a single thing to change it. And so what it does is it puts us in a state of paralysis. It just so infuriates me, and we can't do anything about it. Let me take you back to how we handled this in the beginning of American history. If you take the first 4 battles of the American War for Independence, the Battle of Lexington, 2 hours later, the Battle of North Bridge at Concord, followed by the battle on the road to Boston, followed by Bunker Hill, interesting thing happened. Those 4 battles all happened within a relatively short period of time, and as those battles were occurring, nobody contacted the National Command. The Commander-in-Chief said, hey, what do you want us to do here in Lexington? Nobody went to the National Command. They all acted locally. Explain. In the case of this one we talked earlier, Reverend Jonas Clark said, my town will take care of it. Got 70 guys from his church go meet 800 British. But it was a local thing. We're going to fight a local battle here, and my church is going to be at the forefront. 2 hours later, when they got to the North Bridge at Concord, the Reverend William Emerson had 300 guys out there to meet the British. Now, the British have already shot, so now we get to shoot back, and so that's where the first British hit the ground, was at the Battle of Concord Bridge, led by Reverend Emerson and 300 guys from church. And then the British decide, oh, this is not going well. We had 70 guys, now we got 300. We need reinforcements. So they turn and march back to Boston, 19-mile march on the road to Boston, and all along the way, there were several thousand Americans lining the road, shooting at them from both sides. Who were those guys? Well, Reverend Payson Phillips had his church out there, and Reverend Benjamin Balch had his church out there. Every community they went through, it was the church out there defending their community from the enemy that's coming in. When you get to the Battle of Bunker Hill, you had Reverend Joseph Williff who said, I got 2 companies out of my church. We're going across town to fight the British. It was always local stuff. Everything was done local. And so the way we won the American Revolution wasn't because we had a national strategy. The way we won the American Revolution was we kept winning all the local battles. And when you win the local battles, you win the nation. You win it. See, it's the same thing with revivals. We got people praying that we need another revival in America today. This year on the National Day of Prayer, there will be more than 50,000 groups gathered across America praying for revival. But revivals are the same. If you look, for example, the Great Awakenings, George Whitefield was the big name in the Great Awakening. This is a guy that preached for 34 years. He preached 18,000 sermons in 34 years. He did it on horseback. He made 7 trips from Maine to Georgia on horseback, back and forth. Here's the deal. 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. How many communities do you have to be in for 80% of all Americans to hear you? If I told you that 80% of all Texans heard me speak, how many communities do I have to be in? Because back then they didn't have mass media, they didn't have technology. You had to be in it. So the reason we had a great awakening was all the communities got awakened, all the local area. It wasn't a national revival, it was a local revival. And that's why you had Samuel Cooper said, I got Massachusetts, we'll take care of this. And you had Gilbert Tennant said, oh, we got Pennsylvania, no worries. And that's where you had Samuel Davis, we got Virginia. I mean, it was all these folks looking locally at where they were and getting revival started there. And that's what led to a national revival. So see, we're so often used to seeing things from the top down. You got to see it from the bottom up. It goes the other way. And so that's where we have to get off that obsession that we have with a national focus. If you need to, turn the news off and start looking at your school board news and start looking at your public utility district and look at the water. Look at all the stuff going on around. Win those battles. You win those battles, we'll win the county. You win the county, you'll win the state. You win the state, you'll win the nation. That's the way we have to go at things. So all of that has to do with tending the garden. So those are the three areas I wanted to cover for you today. And One Nation Under God and some black history and role of pastors and churches. But I've got great optimism for where America is heading because of what I see coming up. But it is still a slow, long battle. We didn't lose this in 1 year. We're not going to get it back in 1 year. This is something you get engaged in. You will reap if you faint not, is what we're told in Galatians 6. So be engaged and get in the battle. Melvin, thank you for letting me share, brother. All yours.
Okay, we want to also have a Q&A session. Hopefully, are you getting some information that you hadn't heard before? Amen. And it's all rooted in God's Word. And as David Barton has said, and as Dave Welch has said, and I think it's commonly felt that we've been shortchanged when it comes to American history. And hopefully you can see how much our forefathers, our foreparents depended upon God, and how successful and how wonderful it is to know. And hopefully it gives you some encouragement and some inspiration to do even more for God's purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, I give back to you, David Barton.
Yes, sir. Okay, we'll take a few minutes for questions and answers. Anybody got anything you want to ask?
I have a problem getting my...
Oh, Melvin's got a mic coming. Great.
Thank you. I have a problem getting my pastor involved with the church, involved with this kind of activity. Do you have any recommendations for books, and do you have any good ideas to work with him on?
Yes. I'm trying to decide whether I want to make everybody commit suicide before I tell the answer to that. Let me kind of give you a picture. I mentioned in the book, This Precarious Moment, that one of the issues we deal with is where the church is. Right now in America, there are 384,000 churches and senior pastors in America. Calling 500 to 600 a day, again through George Barna, pollster, we call 500 to 600 a day and we ask them 6 easy questions. Do you think there is absolute moral truth? Are there things that are definitely right and wrong? Can you earn your way into heaven? Is Satan a real being, or is that an imaginary being on who we blame things? If you pray, will God answer prayer? Did Jesus live a sinless life? It's six easy things. Right now, 72% of pastors say they do not agree with those 6 teachings. So that is the easiest stuff in the Christian faith for 2,000 years. 72% of pastors say they do not agree with that. When it comes down to the 28% that do, we call them theologically conservative. They believe the Bible. So in asking them, do you think the Bible addresses every issue of life? And gave them 14 things. Does the Bible address immigration? Does it address sexuality? Does it address economics? Does it address education, etc.? Things that are in the news on a daily basis. And depending on what one of the 14 issues were, between 91 and 97% of that 28% of pastors said, yes, the Bible absolutely addresses those issues. Great, that's good news. I mean, the fact you get 28%, that's 100,000 pastors who think the Bible addresses the issues of the day. So we then asked, have you talked about any of those issues in the last 2 years, or do you plan to talk about any of those issues to your congregation? Things that are in the news, do you? And 90% of pastors said, absolutely not. That would be preaching politics. Wait a minute. you told me it was in the Bible. So if it's in the Bible, how is it preaching politics? And so what we find today, only 2.8% of pastors are willing to address what the Bible addresses if it's also in the news. So pretty much if it's in the news, I ain't touching it. My gosh. You know how many things Jesus talked about that were in the news? He said, did you guys see the Tower of Siloam that fell on 18 people? And, you know, just look at him. He's covering the news of the day. So the answer to that is we have a system of pastoral education right now that says, oh, don't offend anybody. Don't get into issues that might offend. And unfortunately, Jesus believed that. He didn't offend anybody. Wait a minute. I think he got killed for offending people. And he's the only perfect guy in the world, and he still got killed for... So you remember he told the disciples, hey, if they treated me bad, they're going to treat you bad too. We seem to want to not be treated bad, which is understandable, but the church is not in that position. The church has got to be the beacon of right and wrong, of light, a standard of training people. So one of the things we did was in that 28% of churches that say they do believe the Bible, we went to the people in the pews of those 28% of the churches and asked them, we said, and by the way, let me back up. 2 out of 3 Christians say that they get nothing useful from church that they can apply during the week. So they go to church, they give an hour or 2 or 3, and during the week there's nothing they can apply. So that's why church attendance is declining. You know, I got better things to do. I can get more application out of watching a football game than I can going to some churches. So that's why it's declining. And 3 out of 4 Christians say they will not invite someone else to go to church with them. They don't even want somebody in their church. So what we did was we went to the people in the pews of those 28% of the churches and said, what do you feel like you need to be trained on? You're in the culture. What do you need training on to be equipped to take on the culture? And there were actually 14 areas where the 70% of churchgoers said, I really wish my pastor would address this and teach me about this. And so we have on our website, wallbuilders.com, there is a national poll called God's People Want to Know. God's People Want to Know. This is where 70% of churchgoers said, I really want to know this. So that's one resource, is show the pastor, hey, pastor, did you know that people, they really want to hear these issues talked about? Because these are practical things. Jesus was very practical about helping the disciples live out their faith. I mean, the stories he gave on economics and on criminal justice, and I could take you through so many teachings of Jesus in the Bible we never pay attention to. We look at the spiritual stuff, but the spiritual stuff is also economic stuff, and it's also civil justice and etc. So that's one thing, is go to that. Sometimes seeing in history that there is a different view can be helpful. We have a DVD and a book called The Role of Pastors and Christians in Civil Government. Had it not been for the pastors back in the American founding, there is no United States of America today, hands down. The British called the pastors the Black Robe Regiment because they all wore black robes. And they blamed the American War for Independence on the pastors. That's why when they caught a pastor, that was the highest attrition rate during the American Revolution was pastors. When they caught a pastor, that's a guy who's not going to live. They had assassination teams that would assassinate pastors, James Caldwell and others. So the British blamed what we became on the church. I don't think anybody's going to worry about the church getting blamed for that today. Well, maybe so, in the wrong direction. You know, what we become and not being who you should be. So those are a couple of resources I would point to. There's also a good book out by a great theologian, Wayne Grudem. It's called Politics According to the Bible. It shows the Bible verses that apply to issues that are in the news. And then there is one more book by Pastor Jim Garlow. It's called Well Versed. It takes about 40 current issues and puts Bible verses to them to give application to issues. So those are 4 resources that I can think of right off the top that might help. But here's the other thing you need to know is if you can get your pastor to start talking about stuff like that, they will get criticized, guarantee it. And what we have found in America is that the group that is most vocal in speaking is usually the minority group that does not represent the rest of them, and people who are normal are people who don't complain much at all. And so what will happen is the complaints come, for example, if your pastor does something on what the Bible says about debt and economics and having a savings account, Proverbs 6, There are going to be people say, Pastor, you shouldn't be political and stuff like that. And so he'll hear from those people. He's not going to hear from the 60 or 70% that really appreciate getting something practical. And so if you want your pastor to do stuff like that, you got to go encourage them and say, Pastor, if you'll do that, you're going to get criticized. That's all right. We got your back. There's a bunch of us that'll defend you and take on whoever comes after you. Just give them some love and support and courage. This will be a new thing for a lot of pastors to try. One of the things we have on our website as well is we have about 260 old historical sermons from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. We put them on there because they're pretty cool sermons dealing with issues of that day and how the church addressed those issues back then very, very practically. Long answer to a short question. Sorry. Next question. Marv?
I'm a college professor, so I deal with millennials and the next generation that's coming up. What is the most important thing that you think that generation needs to know?
Great answer. I'm going to send you to that book, This Precarious Moment. We have a section in there on millennials. Allow me to pull up some slides for just a moment, if you guys will. I want to take you through something real quick on millennials. It's something that a lot of you will know intuitively. Forgive me while I make a change here in front of you on the screen. Right there. Okay. All right, let me get to millennials. Right here. Okay. I'm going to take a few minutes on this answer because I think it's really important. With millennials, also Gen Zers, those are the two most recent generations. Millennials are kind of those 36, 37 down. Gen Zers are going to be 20, 21 down. So in some ways, your Gen Zers could be considered like the kids of the millennials to some degree. When you go to millennials, there are generally 4 categories of millennials. The 4 categories of millennials you'll have. Category number 1 is what's called the faith-driven millennial. Now, I'm not saying these 4 categories are even because they're not. This is definitely the smallest group among millennials, is the faith-driven millennials. And faith-driven doesn't even mean Bible-driven. As a matter of fact, you find that only 4% of millennials have a biblical worldview. So they are very open to lots of religions. One of the fastest growing religions in America right now is Satanism, amazingly. Hundreds of thousands a year joining. So they're very spiritually open, just not necessarily to biblical stuff. They're just looking for anything spiritual. Excuse me. Second is what would be called social justice warriors. They are very aggressive and wanting to make a difference in the culture. So they get involved in all sorts of stuff. You just name the movement. You will see millennials at the front of whatever movement is going on. It doesn't matter what the movement is. And that's a very good characteristic about millennials is they want to make a difference. They want to have a lasting difference. It's interesting. We will not be silent is a characteristic, and this is a large segment of millennials. Again, there's 4 different categories, and they're not all sterile compartments. There's a lot of overlap between. One millennial might be in 3 of the categories, or 4 of them, or 2 or 1. But this thing, they will not be silent. However, we condemn freedom of speech that hurts other people's feelings. They will not be silent, but they don't like hearing views that disagree with what they've been told. So they are very outspoken and very opinionated, and often without knowing why. They repeat what they've been told. They've been educated largely by memes and sound bites. We do training for every summer for 18 through 25-year-olds before they go off to college. We know what they're going to get from the professors. We know the demographics of millennials. And we spend the first 2 or 3 days showing them they're dumb as a rock. And we do that simply by asking them questions. We don't confront them. They have strong opinions, and we start asking them questions that they can't answer about their own opinions. They can't defend it. And then you start asking questions that lead them. And by the way, you'll see in a minute, Jesus was great about asking questions. You know, in the gospel, Jesus asked more than 300 questions. He was not good at answering questions, but he's great at asking questions. And that's how he got his disciples to move. That's how he would shut up the Pharisees. That's how he would change the course of using questions. And so for the 2-week training, first 2 or 3 days, we'll do nothing but ask questions about what they believe, what they say. Why did you say that? Can you prove that? What's the evidence for that? Have you seen that work anywhere else? And it just kind of blows them away. We just leave them hanging. Then we come back with, there's more that you need to know. And so here's some of the others. So that's the second thing. They don't like the other side. That's why they oppose free speech protection at a rate 2 to 3 times higher than previous generations. Actually, 53% support restrictions on free speech. They disagree with the First Amendment right of free speech. And actually, 19% believe that violence is an acceptable response to free speech they disagree with. Now, that's a dangerous place to be in a nation where that I don't like your opinion, I've got the right to pop you in the nose. 19% think that violence is an acceptable response to free speech they disagree with. So that's a characteristic that has to be dealt with. Category number 3 is what is called pro-socialism. In this category, again, so much millennial education is built on memes and sound bites, and they're no longer taught to think. Since the 1920s, educational pedagogy in America has changed. We used to teach students how to think. We now teach them how to learn. When you become a learner, you just receive whatever comes at you. You don't have the capability to analyze it and say, no, there's another side. Proverbs 18:17, one side sounds good till you hear the other side. So they don't know there's another side oftentimes. So in pro-socialism standpoint, Washington Post, millennials are the only age group in America in which majority view socialism favorably. A Harvard University survey found that 51% do not support capitalism. Millennials have a higher opinion of socialism than of capitalism. Moreover, Gallup has found that an astounding 69% of millennials said they'd be willing to vote for a socialist candidate for president. Among their parents' generation, only a third would do so. Now notice, in one generation, we went from a third to nearly 70%. That's a huge, huge, huge transformation in one generation. So George Barna, as I pointed out, does a lot of polling. I love Barna because he does not let you get away with just giving an answer. He will ask you the same question different ways to actually get at what you believe. So in the case of asking Americans, do you support socialism? Over, not just millennials, but overall Americans, 41% of Americans said they support socialism. He then went through another 41 questions. Another 41 questions, do you support greater government control of businesses, which is part of socialism? Do you support greater government ownership of private property? So he went through all the characteristics of socialism without saying it is socialism. When he got done, only 2% supported socialism, but they just didn't know what it was. So this is the problem, is we've heard that socialism is really good, and I don't really know what it is. When you tell them what it is, they don't agree with it. So this is why I say we have a very poorly educated group. They don't know how to think. And this is something that, again, since the 1920s, they're educated in sound bites. These are some of the memes that are very popular. This one, socialism, the radical idea of sharing. Is there anyone who's opposed to sharing? No. So I'm for socialism, because if I'm for sharing, see, that's the connection that's made. This is the kind of stuff that go, I want socialism because I want to share. I want everybody to be able to share. Another one, pro-life. Then how could you let people die without health insurance? That's an interesting redefinition of pro-life. If I'm pro-life, then what it means is I support single-payer universal health care. And that's not what we mean when we talk about pro-life. But see, this is a new definition. They take words that will commonly, so oftentimes, we'll talk to them in English and they'll hear in French, or we'll talk in Russian and they'll hear in German. We can use the same terms, but they have different meanings because of the way education has gone. Here, capitalism, where you can enslave fellow humans and rape the planet and be praised for your good business sense. Well, I'm certainly against enslaving human beings. I certainly don't want to rape the planet, so I must be against capitalism, because that's what capitalism does. That's not the right definition, but again, we're educated in sound bites and memes. Our lives are worth more than their profits, which has led to the people before profit movement. Now, I don't know where this came from. Tell me, did Walmart get rich because they focused on profits or on serving people? The more they serve people, the more money they make. Oh, by the way, that's the way the free market system works. They'll bring the groceries to your car. You can now text them. You can now call in ahead. They'll go pull it off the shelves for you. They'll do more and more and more and more of what you want, which is why they get more and more money. They don't put profits before people. No company can stay in business if they put profits before people. So, as you think through this stuff, they go, oh, yeah, that's right, because I got more service at Walmart than I've ever had before. This is where you start asking questions. So, socialist, the biggest face for socialism today at a presidential level is certainly Bernie Sanders. No question about it. 75% of college students support Bernie Sanders. Now, it's interesting to me that 21-year-old kids support a 75-year-old candidate. So this is a generation that doesn't care that much about age. They care more about what you believe and who you are and whether you're genuine or not. So Bernie Sanders, 75% support him. So that's the pro-socialism, and this is a very large group among millennials. And again, there's some overlap with these and other groups. The fourth and final group with millennials is what we call moral libertarians. Moral libertarians, 4 out of 5 millennials say there is no absolute moral truth. Thank you very much, Pastor. And so we'll ask the kids coming in that we train in the summer, do you believe? Absolutely. No, there's nothing absolutely right or wrong. So if I pop you in the nose and take your smart device, that's okay, right? Well, no, you can't do that. Wait a minute. If I think it's right, who are you to tell me that I'm not right? And they'll, oh. So when my wish meets the end of your nose, then there's rights and wrongs suddenly. And so, you know, if a guy thinks he should be able to rape a girl, that's his desire. He thinks that's right. Why should she say no? And so you start putting all these opposite, and they don't know how to handle that. They don't know what to do with that, because suddenly, hey, the Las Vegas shooter who sat up in the hotel and shot all those people, do you think that was right? That was absolutely wrong. Oh, so you do believe in absolutes. So you can get them in absolutes. It only takes us 2 or 3 minutes to get them believing in absolutes, but they've been told that that's a wrong view to have, that there are no absolutes. You get to identify what your own rights and wrongs are. So as a consequence, this is statistically, casual sex is a normal part of dating in millennial relationships. National Public Radio says cohabitation before marriage is now almost a rite of passage. This is something that's going to happen in overwhelming majority of millennial relationships. Only 25% believe that it is morally wrong for a couple to live together with no intention of getting married, so just for gratuitous sex. Next, traditional male-female marriage is not highly esteemed. 59% of millennials have never married, a percentage much higher than any previous generation. STD rates are soaring, including HIV. Used to be that there were only 6 sexually transmitted diseases in America. There are now 26 sexually transmitted diseases in America, and 4 of them are incurable. We hear about AIDS, HIV, but there's 4 that are incurable. So, I mean, the moral behavior is just absolutely, and millennials are having real problems with that, and just we don't get that news because that's their lifestyle. They can choose what they want to choose. So 57% of children born to millennials are born outside of marriage, the highest percentage of any generation on record ever in America. 57% of millennials seek out pornography. 74% of them think pornography is a moral behavior. 2/3 see gender as fluid rather than fixed, and half see gender as a spectrum of various identities. So this is the moral believing of 41% of the American population. 41% of the population is millennial and below. So you're looking at this. Now, when you look at all 4 of these categories together, I will point out to you that no nation in history has ever survived these beliefs becoming policy. Millennials are the next generation of everything. They're the next generation of doctors, of teachers, of preachers, of parents, of everything. No nation's ever survived socialism. No nation's ever survived a lack of morality. No nation has ever survived any of these positions, an economic change. So the governmental change, economic change, lack of free speech expression, no nation's ever been able to survive that. So what they believe right now is going to end the nation. And I don't mean to be melodramatic. I'm just telling you, you find a nation in history that believes what they believe and that has survived. You won't. It's not there. They just don't know that. So Gen Z, same kind of stuff. So solutions to this, the way you deal with millennials is very simple. It's all about truth, but they don't know that because often they don't believe there's absolute truth, but there is absolute truth. I can have fun with them at times and saying, well, you know, I know you want to create your own truth. Well, here's the deal. I want you to go to the 86th floor of the Empire State Building. I want you to jump off and all the way down and say, gravity's not going to hurt me. Gravity won't affect me. My truth says you can say what you want. There are laws that you cannot contradict. And the law of gravity is one of them. Laws of science, laws of sexuality, laws of all sorts of stuff. It doesn't matter what you believe. Science is not impressed with your beliefs. There are fixed laws that will not change. So we get to that eventually. But there is absolute truth. And the way you can communicate that absolute truth, 3 things. You have to start by building relationships. Millennials are the most relational generation in American history. They're the only generation we have on record in polling where the millennials want to spend time with the boss. Now, other people say, we don't spend time with the workers. I don't want to get around the boss. So millennials want to be mentored. They want to be with someone. They want to be with the boss. So they're open, but they want relationships first. So you don't go get a millennial and try to teach them how dumb they are and how you got the answers.
What you do is you take them out for a Coke or ice cream 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Once they figure out you're real, you're really concerned about them, and you really do care, they'll start listening to your conversations. It's exactly what Jesus did with the woman at the well. He kept talking to her, asking her questions, finally got her around to a question that was significant, but he just spent time with her. And that's what Jesus did with so many people, just spent time with them, the relationship. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you're able to introduce metrics once they trust you and know you. Metrics are measurements that can be used. For example, marriage is not a big deal among millennials. So this is their thing. Getting married and settling down isn't the most important thing in my life. And say, and now we got a relationship. Hey, I came across a study recently that really is interesting to me. It said that those that are married have a much higher economic income than those that are single. And this is even if just one spouse is working. Even if just one of the spouses is working, look how much more, isn't that interesting? And by the way, did you know that if you're married, you have the lowest poverty rate of any group out there? Look at this, 8.3% to 38%. That's 500% lower. Mike, I wonder why that is. Don't have to tell them what it is. Just show them metrics. Now, of course, millennials don't believe in this, but millennials have trouble with this. Do you know that polling-wise, millennials are the poorest generation in American history to date? No generation, but there's no generation that's had as little marriage and as many kids. 57% of millennials have been born outside of marriage themselves, and 59% of their kids are born outside of marriage, which does nothing but drive up all this. So you can use metrics. And the same thing, they think that alternative sexual behaviors is just, it's a lifestyle. You can choose your own morals, choose your own behavior. Say, an interesting thing, I was looking at the website, I want to give blood, and I went to the Red Cross website, and they had some interesting things in there from the Centers for Disease Control, and they had the things from the Food and Drug Administration, and they say that homosexuals can't give blood if they're acting like homosexuals. They say the only way you can give blood is if you have not had a homosexual relationship in at least 12 months. You have to have been celibate. That seems discriminatory. I wonder why the government discriminates against homosexuals. Well, it could be what they say here. Homosexuals have an HIV prevalence 60 times higher than the general population, 800 times higher than first-time blood donors, and 8,000 times higher than repeat blood donors. There's something about that behavior that has a change scientifically. It may be what you choose, but there are consequences to what you choose. And I go on, they have a hepatitis C infections 2 times higher than general population, hepatitis B infections 5 to 6 times higher than population, and they comprise less than 2% of the population, but account for 63% of all syphilis cases. Maybe all lifestyles aren't equivalent. But see, that's something new for them. This is stuff, they have never heard this before in their life. So once you create a relationship, you can introduce some facts into it. This is not a weekend conversion. You're not going to get these kids turned around. This is going to be, I love this. This is discipleship. This is where Jesus said, go make disciples of all men. It takes time to build a relationship, make disciples. Final thing, in addition to use of metrics, and by the way, this is nothing more than what Jesus said, a bad tree can't bear good fruit. He just judges the results. And so metrics are used. The third thing I'd point you to is questions. As I mentioned, Jesus asked a lot of questions, 300 questions. One, an easy one is, I see you really like socialism. Pretty cool. We need to share, and it's really good to be concerned about others. But I was thinking about this the other day, and we have 195 nations in the world today, and we've had nations for 5,500 years. There's been several thousand nations in history, and hundreds of those nations have been socialistic nations. Can you think, or can you find any of those nations in 5,500 years that have been socialistic where that it increased prosperity and provided freedom? You won't find a single nation. And suddenly you're saying, wait a minute, if it's never worked before, maybe it won't work this time either. See, all you got to do is ask questions. And so these are 3 things I would throw out, is this each one, reach one kind of stuff. So that's a really long answer to a really short question, but that's where we are with millennials. And the only way you're going to make a change is building relationships. And if you're a millennial, I'm not talking down to you at all. And by the way, the other thing is, where did millennials get all these dumb ideas? They did not come up with them themselves. They were raised by parents and had education that taught them. These are not the product that they came up with. This is what they have been taught. Look in a mirror. You don't like where millennials are now? Look in a mirror, because we're the ones who got them there. I mean, we got to take responsibility for that. Jesus says, Luke 6:40, every student, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher. And that's parents, and that is culture and education. So, all right, other questions? Melvin, when do we need to shut it down? We're at 4 now. What do you want me to do, sir?
More questions?
Got one over here.
Okay, I'll come back here.
Thank you for your answer, by the way. That was
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. And by the way, let me throw out one other thing. Once we teach millennials how to use questions, I have seen, and no disrespect to you as a professor, but we have seen millennials completely convert their professors simply by asking questions. This last session, we had a millennial that took a professor that was pro-abortion, asked 2 or 3 questions. Professor couldn't answer them and became pro-life as a result of, I've never thought about that, never heard that. We had a kid who texted us one time and said, my professor just told me that all the founding fathers were raging alcoholics. I don't think that's right, but I don't know what to say. What do we do? And we said, first, you do not be disrespectful. You go to that professor and say, man, that's the most interesting thing I think I've ever heard. I want to check more into that. What sources can I look at to tell me that? And just ask for sources. And the professor said, I saw an article in Huffington Post one time that said that, and she heard herself say that. It's like, oh my gosh. And so the student kept after, well, I'd really like to get some more stories. Is there anything else? I saw a program on History Channel once that I think said something about that. And so suddenly the professor says, that's the only 2 sources I got. I just told the whole class they were raging alcoholics. So asking questions is a very, very, very useful thing that we teach millennials to do to get not only their peers, but the system around them changed in different directions. So again, questions really good. Question over here.
Yeah. Yes, sir. I don't know if I'm a millennial or a GX. I'm just young. My friends call me a black nerd, and I love black history to my heart. And what you have done has shocked me, and I didn't even know some of that stuff. So my question is, have you ever thought about, if you ever got a chance to, go to some of these black colleges like Paul Quinn, Prairie View, TSU, where there is a battle going on where you got professors, young black professors who's never been involved in the civil rights movement, really didn't have no bad experience of segregation like the previous generations have, but are spreading this anger and lies about this country to our young black children, and then they go out of college mad at every white person they see, or every black person they see that want to achieve themselves through the American dream. Have you ever thought about going up there and finally confronting these folk and shocking these people like you shocked me?
Answer is yes. Since this is the last question, I'm going to show you a few slides on this too. So hang on just a minute. Let me go to this. Go here just a minute. Let me look up something. There it is. All right. Yeah. Okay. The answer is yes, we do some of that. I've spoken at traditional historic black universities. It's really kind of funny. I mean, clearly I'm very white, and I spoke for, I'm just going to take Walter Reed for a minute. Walter Reed, huge medical facility. I've got 2 kids, Army. And at Walter Reed, they had me come in and speak for Black History, their Black History Month presentation. Large auditorium, 500-600 black folks in there. And all the advertisements they did not put my picture up at all on the advertisements. And they kept me completely behind stage until after they had introduced me. So there was just a packed auditorium, all these black folks out there, and they introduced me, and I walk out, the white guy, and it was a audible gasp, and you know, the murmur starts going, and so I start getting into these stories that they've never heard before. When I got done and it was over, there was a colonel, black colonel, came marching right up, got right in my face like a drill sergeant. He said, I know exactly why they didn't put your picture up. You're a white guy. This is Black History Month. He said, I was so angry. He said, but you know what you said I've never heard before in my life. That's the best Black History presentation I've ever heard. And I go, okay. I thought I was going to get knocked out. I was at Southern University Law School, another great black college, great law school. And I know very often what students have been taught about whether it be white privilege or racism. Founding fathers were all bigots, slave owners, racists, etc. And again, there were a part that were. I'll point out to you that about 1/4 of the founding fathers who signed the Constitution Declaration were racist. No excuse for it. 3/4 were not. But everybody hears the founding fathers were a bunch of racists. And so I put up a slide of the founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention. I said, you know, it's really unfortunate. I put up the Signers' Declaration, 56 founding fathers. And I told the law school, I said, it's really unfortunate that America was founded by a bunch of racist and bigot slave owners. And I said, that's right. And just going on. I said, by the way, can you point out to me up there any of those founding fathers that were racist slave owners? They said, Thomas Jefferson. I said, all right, that's one. There's 55 more to go. Who else? They couldn't come up with a single name. I said, okay, so we know one owned slaves, and that makes them all racist, bigots. And they looked at each other and was like, oh my gosh. You know, and so asking them the question, suddenly they were open to hearing new things because they've never heard about the other guys. And I can take them through all the founding fathers who were hardcore abolitionists, who started the national abolition movement, etc. So with what's being taught today, let me run real quickly through 7 things that you need to know about slavery. And by the way, this goes back to the thing, I believe you tell the truth. Sometimes you try to make it as soft as you can, but you still tell the truth. If you know the truth will set you free. So 7 important things to know about slavery. The first thing is that slavery was barbaric and inhumane. There is no question about it. What happened? My question is, how many times do you have to beat to have scars that big? When you have scars that big on your back, how many times do you have to get beat and beat to the bone? I mean, so there's no question. We agree on that. That's not debatable. Can we agree that racism is a sin? Yes. Here's where it becomes interesting. If it's a sin, then it affects all human beings. It's not a sin just because white people do it. It's a sin because everybody does it. Do you know there is not a single race in history that was not enslaved itself and that did not enslave others? Not a single race in the history of the world. So you take what happened in Rwanda. These are the 3 groups fighting, the Tutsi, the Hutu, and the Hwa. One group butchered 1 million of the others. Why? Well, they're all black. Yeah, but this group didn't like that group, and that's racism because they're from the wrong side of the black. See, that was you look at civil wars across the world. It's not a matter of white on black. It's a matter of racism is a problem in human hearts. It's a problem in Hispanics. It's a problem with Native Americans. You know, the way that the Apaches will treat the Navajo, and you know, I mean, it's human problem. That's why it's a sin. It's not just for one. It's interesting that we're into looking 300 years back into slavery, but today we have more slavery in the world today than we've had in the history of the world. There are 40 million. So if we're concerned about slavery, how about let's be concerned about 40 million in slavery today? I have yet to see a single professor talk about the 40 million enslaved today, but they want to talk about the slavery that happened back then. And by the way, in 350 years of the African slave trade, there were 10.7 million Africans brought out of Africa into slavery. 388,000 went to North America, which is Mexico, Canada, and the United States, went to the Spaniards, and went to the French, went to the Dutch, and to the English. So that's 3.6% of all slaves brought to Africa went to all of North America. 42% of all slaves brought out of Africa went to Brazil. 10% went to Jamaica, etc. America has 3.6%, which was not good, but how come that's the only nation you hear about? Why not about the 42% that went to Brazil or the 10% that went to Jamaica? Or why not make a distinction between those that went to Mexico with the Spaniards, those that went to Canada with the French, and those that went to the United States with the English? Because that 3.6% is all three of them. See, there's no distinction made. So we focus on, and there's no excuse for the 3.6%. I'm not saying that, but we don't get the full picture. There are more individuals in slavery today than at any time at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. By the way, I'm the head of an organization called the Nazarene Fund, where in the last 4 years, we have literally gone in and rescued people out of slavery with guns, literally. We do that from ISIS. ISIS has sex slaves. Last week, we identified another 19,000 sex slaves being held by ISIS. We hire the KRG, the Kurds, to go in, fight them. 3 of our guys have been killed in rescuing slaves, but we get slaves out. We're able to send them. Australia takes everyone that we will send them. Australia is open arms for anyone we send. We also send them to Brazil once they're freed. We send them into Canada. We send them into Slovakia. We can send them everywhere except the United States. The policy was you don't accept Christians, you accept other groups, but Christians are not on the receiving list. That has started to change in the last 18 months. We're now able to send Christians to America, but we have literally saved tens of thousands of persecuted Christians in the Middle East who have been made sex slaves. So it affects all humans. Now, let's get to the other points. Let me run through it real quick. Jamestown is where slavery was introduced. It was introduced by a man named Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was an indentured servant. He was a black man. Indentured servant means, I want to go to America, but it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars. I can't afford it. And a guy says, well, I'll pay your tens of thousands, but when you get there, you work for me for 7 years and then you're free. So indentured servant is not slavery. It was a way of getting a loan and paying it back. Well, once Anthony Johnson was free, he started hiring indentured servants. They would come to work for him for 3, 5, 6, 7 years, whatever the expense was. He was a wealthy black landowner in Virginia, and he had one indentured servant that after 7 years was up, Anthony Johnson said, "You're the most worthless servant I've ever had. I didn't get my money back out of you in 7 years." He went to court in Virginia and asked the Virginia court, he said, "This guy, it'll take the rest of his life to pay off what he owes me. I asked the Virginia court to let me own this guy for the rest of his life so that he can work for me." That's the first time you had slavery in America, and it was because a black man went to court to own another black man. Now, no one gets that, but that's the first slavery in America. And by the way, well, we'll come to that in a moment. Fact number 3 is free blacks as slave owners. Carter Woodson, who is the father of black history in America, went through the census in 1860, and what he found was that in South Carolina, 43% of free blacks owned black slaves in South Carolina. In Louisiana, 40% of free blacks owned black slaves, 26% in Mississippi, 25% in Alabama, Georgia. So there was a high percentage of free blacks who owned black slaves. Again, it's a hard issue. You see here all the Native Americans? What do you see there? A whole lot of black faces. As it turns out, in the census of 1860, one out of every 8 persons among 5 major Native American tribes is a black slave. Indians practiced slavery at a very high rate, and Indians also enslaved others. When the 13th Amendment ended slavery in America, it did not affect the Indian tribes because they are not part of the United States, they're their own nations. So in the Indian nations, they kept slavery going a long time longer, and they enslaved other Indians. So you don't hear anything about that part of slavery in America. Native American slave owners enslaved each other, and they lasted longer than black slavery did. Point number 5 is that when you look at white slavery was a big part of early America as well. As a matter of fact, there were several ports where they sent out more white slaves than they did black slaves. The first slave law in America, passed 1671, allowed you to own black slaves, white slaves, or Indian slaves. So white slavery was a part of American history. Point number 6, Muslim slave traders. These guys, in a period of the first couple centuries of America, they took 1.25 million slaves in the early American period, and they were looking not for blacks or whites, they were looking for Christians. So there were a number of white Christians who were slaves of Muslims in the American founding. And then Southern whites, this is where we have the plantation slavery, this is where we see all the abominations that go with slavery, but you still have to remember that 92% of Southerners did not own slaves. So we're talking 8% who did. But there's institutional racism, Jim Crow law, and take through all the laws. But these are all facts that you have to put together in the whole story of slavery in America. Tell me any academic place that gives all the facts. Okay? So when I go through and present facts like that, they're like, never heard that. See, slavery, no, racism is a heart problem, which affects all humans across the board. So, long answer to a short question again, but yes. What I try to do is what I did at the start of this. I really love telling stories and telling positive, uplifting stories like Wentworth Cheswell and stories Lemuel Haynes and others, and then people get hooked on that because it is positive. And then I can come back with negative stuff later once you show there's another side. So I don't start with this stuff. I start with very positive stories, but there's a lot of history out there. Thank you guys for letting me share with you.
So I pray that you all have had a very enlightening time this afternoon. And this is all about we who are of the body of Christ come to realize that we have some things in common, that we are one nation under God. So I trust and pray that we leave here not just hoping, not just feeling, but David has given us some information that we can walk away believing that we all have a part to play in the future of this great nation. So God bless you. May continue to keep you as our prayer. And again, thank you for being with us. God bless.